The schoolmaster stood in the doorway of the one-room schoolhouse as the first snow of autumn dusted the air like powdered sugar, and when the green-skinned girl with small tusks and pointed ears climbed the steps alone, he simply said, "I will walk you home each day," and she looked at him with eyes the color of amber, wary as a fox in a snare. Fera Fairwind was 18 years old, willowy as a birch sapling, with braided black hair that fell past her shoulders and hands that trembled slightly as she gripped the strap of her empty satchel. She had never held a book in her life, until 2 weeks ago when the territorial governor had opened enrollment to all peoples, orc and human alike, and her father had scraped together the tuition from 3 years of blacksmithing because he wanted his daughter to read the contracts that cheated their family, to write the letters that might change their fortunes. The schoolmaster, Kieran Yates, was 32, lean and weathered like driftwood, with dark hair going silver at the temples and a face that rarely showed what he thought. He taught reading and arithmetic and natural philosophy to 17 human children ranging from 6 to 16, and now one orc girl who sat at the back bench, spine straight, trying to make herself small. "That is unnecessary," Fera said quietly, her voice carrying the faint growl that marked all orc speech. "I know the road." "So do the Hendricks boys," Kieran replied, and that was all he said before turning back into the schoolhouse, leaving her to follow or flee. She followed. The first day of lessons crawled by like a wounded animal. The younger children stared openly until Kieran rapped his knuckles on the desk and directed their attention to their slates. The older students, farmhands' sons and daughters who should have been working the harvest but were granted autumn for learning, whispered behind their hands. Fera copied her letters with fierce concentration, her quill scratching too hard, twice tearing through the cheap paper Kieran provided. When the afternoon bell rang, a hand-hammered triangle that sang across the frost-brittle air, Kieran simply collected his coat and waited by the door. The other students scattered like startled birds, racing toward distant farms and the village proper. Fera gathered her things slowly, hoping he might forget or change his mind. He did neither. They walked in silence through town, past the general store where the proprietor stopped sweeping to watch them pass, past the smithy where Fera's father looked up from his anvil with an expression caught between gratitude and grief, past the churchyard where the minister paused in his pruning. The road beyond the village was rutted dirt turning to mud where the frost melted, lined with bare oak trees and split rail fences marking pastureland where cattle huddled against the cold. Kieran matched her pace exactly, neither leading nor following, his boots crunching fallen leaves in rhythm with hers. He did not speak. He did not look at her. He simply walked, and after a mile the tension in Fera's shoulders began to ease, though she could not say why. Her family's cottage sat at the forest edge, smoke rising from its chimney, chickens scratching in the yard. When they reached the gate, Kieran touched the brim of his hat, a gesture so slight she nearly missed it, and turned back toward town without a word. The second day was the same. And the third. And the fourth. By the second week, the novelty had worn thin for the other students who returned to their lessons and their games and forgot, mostly, that an orc sat among them. Fera began to relax enough to raise her hand once, twice, to answer questions about sums and syllables. Kieran called on her as he called on everyone, his voice level and without particular warmth or coldness. And when she answered correctly, he nodded. And when she stumbled, he corrected her the same way he corrected young Timothy Fletcher, gently and without judgment. The walks remained silent, but the silence changed. It became companionable, a shared quiet rather than an awkward void. Fera found herself noticing things. The way Kieran favored his left leg slightly, An old injury, perhaps. The book that always bulged in his coat pocket, its spine cracked from repeated reading. The way he paused at the same oak tree each day to brush his hand against its trunk, a gesture so unconscious she wondered if he even knew he did it. 3 weeks into the term, she spoke. "Why do you teach?" He glanced at her sidelong, his gray eyes thoughtful. "Someone taught me once, seemed right to return the favor. You could make more money doing other work. Money is not everything. Easy to say when you have enough of it." A smile ghosted across his face, there and gone like a candle flame in wind. "Fair point." They walked another dozen paces before he asked, "Why do you want to learn?" "So I can read the contracts," Fera said. "So they cannot cheat us anymore. So my people do not have to mark with thumbprints like children or fools." Kieran nodded slowly. "Noble reason." "Practical reason," she corrected. "Those are not mutually exclusive." She considered that, turning the words over in her mind like river stones. "I suppose not." Winter arrived in earnest, snow piling in drifts that turned the daily walk into a trudge. Kieran began carrying a shovel, clearing the worst of the path each morning before school so the journey home was easier. He never mentioned it, never asked for thanks, simply did the work as though it were as natural as breathing. One afternoon, when the snow fell so thick they could barely see 10 feet ahead, Fera stumbled in a hidden rut and would have fallen if Kieran had not caught her elbow. His grip was steady, impersonal, and he released her the moment she found her footing. "Careful," he said. "I am always careful," she replied, more sharply than she intended. "I know." Something in his voice made her look at him properly, seeing past the weathered face and severe expression to the man beneath. He was tired, she realized. Deep tired, the kind that came from years of carrying weight alone. "Were you a soldier?" she asked. "Once. Long ago." "Is that where you hurt your leg?" He raised an eyebrow. "You notice too much. You walk me home every day. Of course I notice." "Yes," he said after a moment. "That is where I hurt it." They did not speak again until they reached her gate, but something had shifted. A door opening just a crack. December brought the winter examinations, and Fera studied by candlelight until her eyes burned and her father worried she would make herself sick. The younger children took their tests first, simple recitations and basic sums, and then the older students faced written examinations that would determine whether they advanced or repeated the year. Fera's hands shook as she took up her quill. The examination covered grammar, mathematics, history, and natural philosophy, and she worked through each section with painstaking care, forming her letters as perfectly as she could manage, checking her arithmetic twice, and then a third time. When she handed in her papers, Kieran's face revealed nothing. The next day he walked her home as always, and they were halfway to her cottage when he said, "You scored highest in the class." Fera stopped walking. "What? Highest marks?" "Beat the Fleming boy by 8 points, and he has been studying since he was 6. She could not find words. "You earned it," Kieran said. "Every point." Pride swelled in her chest, warm and fierce, and she smiled so wide her small tusk showed. Kieran smiled back, a real smile this time, and it transformed his face entirely, making him look younger and less burdened. "Thank you," Fera said, "for teaching me. Thank you for being an excellent student." That evening she told her father, who lifted her off her feet in a hug that cracked her ribs, and her mother cried happy tears into her apron. And for the first time Fera let herself believe that the future might be different than the past. January arrived cold and clear, the snow packed hard enough to walk on without breaking through. The daily walks continued, and now they talked about everything: philosophy and history, the nature of justice, the ethics of war, the way language shaped thought. Fera argued passionately, her education giving her weapons she had never possessed before, and Kieran countered with calm logic and occasional dry humor that made her laugh despite herself. "If a king rules by divine right," she said one afternoon, "then how can any king be overthrown justly?" "The question presumes the premise is true," Kieran replied. "Perhaps kings rule by consent, and divine right is simply the story they tell to keep their thrones. But people believe the story. People believe many things that are not true. That is a dangerous philosophy for a schoolmaster." "Truth is often dangerous," he said. "That does not make it less true." She looked at him, this stoic man who walked her home each day through snow and cold, who had defended her right to learn without her even knowing it, who spoke of truth as though it mattered more than safety. "You are not what I expected," Fera said. "What did you expect? Someone who saw me as a monster." Kieran stopped walking and turned to face her fully. "I see a young woman who wants to learn. That is all I have ever seen." Her throat tightened. "Most humans do not think that way." "Then most humans are fools." They stood in the winter silence, breath pluming in the frozen air, and Fera felt something shift in her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with exertion or sun. February brought trouble. The Hendricks family, who owned half the farmland in the county and held 3 seats on the school board, objected formally to Fera's continued enrollment. Their eldest son attended the school, a lazy boy of 15 who resented that an orc girl outperformed him, and he had gone home complaining until his father took up the cause. The board called an emergency meeting. Kieran was summoned to explain why he permitted an orc to study alongside human children, as though her presence were a disease that might spread. Fera only learned of this because the postmaster's daughter, a shy girl named Ellen who sometimes shared her lunch, whispered the news in the schoolyard. "They want to expel you," Ellen said, her eyes wide with distress. "My father says the Hendricks are pushing hard and the other board members might give in to keep the peace." Fera felt cold sink through her, deeper than any winter chill. "When is the meeting?" "Tonight." She should have gone home and told her parents, let them decide what to do, but instead she waited until the final bell and then asked Kieran directly, "Is it true? Will they expel me?" He looked at her for a long moment, his expression carefully neutral. "They will try. And will you stop them?" "I will do everything in my power." "That is not an answer." "It is the only answer I have." They walked in heavy silence, the joy of their recent conversations buried under fear and anger. When they reached her gate, Fera turned to him. "If I am expelled, will you still walk this road?" Kieran's jaw tightened. "You will not be expelled." "But if I am, you will not be," he repeated, and there was steel in his voice now, the soldier showing through the schoolmaster's calm exterior. "I promise you that." The meeting stretched past midnight. Fera sat in her cottage, unable to eat or sleep, while her father paced and her mother prayed to gods who rarely answered orc prayers. When Kieran finally appeared at their door near dawn, exhausted but upright, he carried a letter sealed with the board's official stamp. "They voted to allow her to continue," he said without preamble, "on one condition." "What condition?" Fera's father asked, his deep voice wary. "She must take a public examination at the term's end, before the full board and any citizens who wish to attend. If she passes with distinction, her place is secured for next year. If she fails—" He did not need to finish. "That is not fair," Fera said. "None of the other students must do this." "No," Kieran agreed. "It is not fair, but it is what I could negotiate." Her father put a hand on her shoulder, heavy and warm. "Can you do it?" Fera thought of the months of study, the late nights and early mornings, the way words had slowly transformed from meaningless scratches to vessels of meaning and power. She thought of Kieran walking beside her through snow and rain, never wavering, never complaining. She thought of her mother's tears of joy when she read her first full sentence aloud. "Yes," she said, "I can do it." Kieran's face relaxed slightly. "Good. Then we have work to do." The spring thaw turned the road to soup, and they walked through mud that sucked at their boots while Kieran drilled her on grammar and rhetoric, mathematics and natural philosophy. He began staying late after school ended, going over her weakest subjects, lending her books from his personal collection that she read by firelight until the words swam before her eyes. "You are pushing too hard," her mother worried. "You will make yourself sick." "I cannot afford to be sick," Fera replied and kept studying. March became April and the world turned green. Wildflowers bloomed along the roadside, and the daily walk changed character entirely, from an endurance trial to something almost pleasant. Kieran seemed to relax slightly, his smiles coming easier, and once Fera caught him humming an old marching song under his breath. "You have a terrible voice," she said. "I know." "Why sing at all, then?" "Because it makes me happy." She considered that. "Teach me the words." He did, and they walked together singing badly, and for a little while the examination and the bored and the weight of expectation fell away, leaving only the spring air and the road and the easy pleasure of company. One afternoon in late April, when the apple trees were foaming with blossoms and the air smelled of honey and new grass, Fera asked the question that had been building in her for months. "Why do you do this?" "Really?" Kieran was quiet for several paces. "Do what?" "Walk with me. Fight for me. Care whether I succeed or fail." He stopped at the oak tree where he always paused, his hand resting against the trunk. "When I was young, I had a teacher who believed I could be more than a farmer's son destined for conscription. He taught me to read, to think, to see beyond the boundaries of my small village. He died in the same war that took my leg." Kieran's voice was soft, distant. "I never got to thank him properly, never got to tell him what his faith meant." "So I am your penance," Fera said. "No." He looked at her directly, his gray eyes clear. "You are my hope that good can be passed forward, that faith in another person is never wasted. You are proof that my teacher was right to believe in me because I can believe in you." Her breath caught. "Kieran, and also," he said, a smile tugging at his mouth, "you are an excellent student and I am a selfish man who enjoys teaching someone who actually listens." She laughed, the tension breaking, but his words stayed with her through the walk home, warm and solid as river stones in her pocket. May arrived, and with it the date of the examination. The 15th, a Saturday when the schoolhouse would be open to the public. The board posted notices in town, and the Hendricks family made sure everyone knew that the orc girl would be tested, that her failure would prove orcs had no place in human schools, that the natural order would be restored. Fera stopped sleeping properly. She reviewed her notes until they blurred, recited conjugations and theorems while washing dishes and feeding chickens. Her father grew quiet and worried, her mother anxious. Only Kieran remained calm. "You are ready," he said on their walk 3 days before the examination. "You have been ready for weeks. What if I freeze? What if I forget everything? Then you will remember. You always do. You do not know that." He stopped walking and turned to face her. "Fera, look at me." She did. "You are the finest student I have taught in 10 years. You work harder than anyone I know. You have earned your place a dozen times over." His voice was firm, brooking no argument. "I believe in you absolutely. The only question is whether you believe in yourself." Tears pricked her eyes. "I am afraid." "Courage is not the absence of fear," Kieran said gently. "It is the choice to act despite it." She nodded, not trusting her voice. "And Fera," he hesitated, something shifting in his expression. Whatever happens on Saturday, know that these walks have been the best part of my days. Teaching you has been an honor." Her heart kicked hard against her ribs. "For me as well. The walks, I mean, and the teaching." They stood in the spring sunshine, the air bright with birdsong and the smell of growing things, and Fera understood with sudden clarity that she did not want the walks to end. Examination or no examination, school or no school. She wanted every day to include this, the quiet companionship, the deep conversations, the easy silences. She wanted Kieran Yates, stoic schoolmaster, former soldier, the man who had walked beside her through winter and never wavered. "We should keep going," Kieran said quietly. "The road waits." "Yes," Fera agreed. "It does." Saturday dawned clear and bright, the sky an aching blue. Fera dressed carefully in her best dress, green wool that her mother had embroidered with small flowers, and braided her hair with fingers that shook only slightly. Her parents walked with her to the schoolhouse, her father's hand on her shoulder, her mother murmuring prayers. The schoolhouse was packed. Every seat was taken, and people stood along the walls and crowded in the doorway. The school board sat at a long table at the front. 5 men in dark suits, their faces grave. The Hendricks family occupied the front row, the father smug, the son sneering. But there were friendly faces too. Ellen and her family, the blacksmith's apprentice who bought tools from Fera's father, the minister's wife who had always been kind. And Kieran, standing beside the desk where he taught, his expression calm and assured. "Miss Fairwind," said Chairman Brooks, the eldest board member, "are you ready to begin?" "I am," Fera said, and was proud that her voice did not shake. The examination lasted 3 hours. They started with reading. Fera stood before the assembly and read aloud from 3 different texts, including a dense passage from a philosophy tome that she navigated flawlessly. Then mathematics. She solved problems at the chalkboard, talking through her process while the board watched. Then history. She answered questions about the territorial expansion, the treaty settlements, the formation of the local government. Finally, natural philosophy. Chairman Brooks himself asked the questions, technical and detailed, designed to trip up even a strong student. Explain the process by which plants convert sunlight to energy. Fera did, describing each step clearly. "What are the 3 states of matter and how do they differ?" she answered. "Calculate the force required to move a 50-pound weight up a 15-degree incline." She worked through the mathematics on the board, showing her calculations, question after question, and Fera answered each one, her confidence growing as she realized she knew this material, had studied it so thoroughly that it was part of her now. She was not reciting by rote but understanding, explaining, demonstrating mastery. When Chairman Brooks finally said, "That will be sufficient," Fera felt her legs nearly give out. The board conferred quietly while the audience murmured. The Hendricks family looked less smug now, the father's mouth a tight line. Kieran caught Fera's eye and nodded once, a small gesture of pride and approval. Finally, Chairman Brooks stood. "Miss Fairwind, the board has reviewed your performance today. We have also reviewed your written examination scores from December, which Mr. Yates provided." He paused, and Fera's heart hammered. "Your knowledge is comprehensive, your reasoning sound, and your academic performance exceptional. It is the board's decision that you will be permitted to continue your education here for as long as you choose to attend." The room erupted. Some applauded, others grumbled. The Hendricks family stormed out in disgust. But Fera barely heard any of it, because she was looking at Kieran, and he was smiling at her with such open pride and joy that everything else fell away. Her parents rushed forward to embrace her, her mother sobbing, her father lifting her off her feet again. Friends and neighbors offered congratulations, and even some of the skeptics nodded with grudging respect. When the crowd finally dispersed, Fera found Kieran outside, leaning against the schoolhouse wall in the spring sunshine. "You did it," he said. "We did it," she corrected. "No. That was all you." She moved to stand beside him, their shoulders almost touching. "Will you still walk me home, if you want me to?" "I do." She took a breath. "I want you to walk me home every day, not because I need protection or because it is proper, but because I—" The words stuck, too big and frightening to release. Kieran turned to look at her, and his expression was open now, the careful neutrality gone. "Because you what?" "Because I have come to care for you," Fera said in a rush. "More than a student should care for her teacher. More than is probably wise. And I know that people will talk, that there are laws against—" "There are no laws," Kieran interrupted gently. "Only customs, only prejudice. And you do not care about those things." He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and took her hand in his. His palm was warm and calloused, his grip steady. "I stopped caring about those things the first day I walked you home," Kieran said. "When you looked at me with such suspicion, like I might be a trap. When I realized I wanted to prove you wrong, to be worthy of your trust." He squeezed her hand. "I've cared for you for months, Fera. I was simply waiting for you to finish school before I said so, because it would not have been proper otherwise. And now I have finished," Fera said, a smile tugging at her mouth, "for the year at least. So you can say so now." "I can." He lifted her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles, a gesture so old-fashioned and sweet that her heart turned over. "Fera Fairwind, I care for you deeply. I have loved our walks and our conversations and your brilliant, stubborn mind. And if you would permit me, I would like to continue walking beside you, not as your teacher but as a man who hopes to court you properly." "Yes," Fera said, and then, because once was not enough, "Yes, yes, absolutely yes." He laughed and she laughed, and then he pulled her close and kissed her properly, right there in the spring sunshine where anyone might see. And Fera kissed him back, tasting joy and hope and the promise of a future that they would build together, one step at a time. The summer was sweet and strange, navigating their new relationship under the watchful eyes of the town. Some people objected, of course, muttering about propriety and racial mixing and the wrongness of it all. But more people simply shrugged and went on with their lives, and a surprising number offered tentative congratulations, pleased that the schoolmaster had found happiness after so many solitary years. Kieran courted Fera properly, walking her home still but now stopping to steal kisses at the oak tree, bringing her flowers and books, sitting with her family in the evenings to discuss philosophy and politics, while her father pretended to disapprove, but secretly approved. Fera bloomed under the attention, confident now in ways she had never been before, secure in the knowledge that she was valued for her mind as much as her heart. In August, Kieran asked her father for permission to marry her, a formality since Fera had already told him she would accept. But tradition mattered to her parents, and Kieran wanted to honor that. Her father said yes with tears in his eyes, and her mother immediately began planning, despite Fera's protests, that she wanted something small. They married in September, as the leaves turned gold and the air grew crisp again. The ceremony was held outdoors, in the meadow near the schoolhouse, with the minister officiating and half the town attending. Fera wore a dress of deep blue that her mother had sewn, and Kieran wore his best suit, and when they spoke their vows his voice was steady but his eyes were wet. "I promise to walk beside you," he said, "for all the days I am given." "I promise the same," Fera replied, "through winter and spring, through hardship and joy." They kissed while the assembly cheered, and then they walked together down the road they had traveled so many times, hand in hand, husband and wife. They made their home in a small cottage near the school, close enough that Kieran could walk to work easily but far enough for privacy. Fera enrolled for another year of study, determined to complete the full curriculum, and Kieran taught her alongside the other students, though now he called her Mrs. Yates and struggled not to smile every time he did. The years unrolled like a blessing. Fera finished her education and began tutoring other orc children whose families had moved to the territory, teaching them letters and numbers the way Kieran had taught her. They built a good life together, full of books and conversation and quiet contentment. In their third year of marriage, Fera gave birth to a daughter, a healthy baby with her mother's green skin and her father's gray eyes and a lusty cry that woke the whole house. They named her Nora, and she was the delight of their lives, curious and clever and stubborn as a mule. When Nora was 2, they had a son. Bertrand was calmer than his sister, thoughtful and gentle, with his father's coloring and his mother's strength. He loved books from the moment he could hold them, and Kieran joked that they had produced another scholar. The family grew, their cottage filled with love and laughter and the chaos of children. The town grew too, expanding as more settlers arrived and the school expanded with it. Kieran eventually hired an assistant teacher, a young woman from the East who believed in education for everyone. And together, they built a program that welcomed all students regardless of race or background. Fera looked back sometimes on that first cold morning, when she had climbed the schoolhouse steps alone and afraid, expecting rejection and finding instead a quiet man who offered to walk her home. She thought of the months of silent walks turning to conversation, the slow build of trust and friendship and finally love. She thought of the examination that had proved her worth to skeptics, and the way Kieran had smiled at her after, pride shining in his eyes. But mostly she thought of the walks themselves, the daily rhythm of companionship, the constancy of his presence. That was what had won her heart, not grand gestures or flowery words, but simple reliability, the promise kept every single day. On their 10th anniversary, they walked the old road again, just the two of them while her parents watched the children. It was autumn again, the air crisp and bright, leaves crunching underfoot. They walked in comfortable silence until they reached the oak tree, and Kieran stopped as he always did, his hand on the trunk. "Do you remember the first time we walked this road?" he asked. "I was terrified," Fera admitted. "I thought you might lead me into the woods and leave me there." "Instead, I led you home." "You led me to a home," she corrected, smiling. "Ours." Kieran pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her, and they stood together under the oak's spreading branches while the autumn sun slanted through the leaves. 10 years married, and Fera still felt her heart lift when he smiled at her, still found new things to discuss on their walks, still felt grateful every day for the quiet man who had seen past her green skin and tusks to the person beneath. "Shall we keep going?" Kieran asked eventually, as he always did. "Yes," Fera replied, as she always did. "The road waits." And so they walked on together, hand in hand, through the bright autumn afternoon, while behind them the schoolhouse stood solid and welcoming, its doors open to all who sought knowledge, a testament to the power of education and the stubbornness of two people who had refused to accept the world's narrow definitions of who could learn and who could love. The road stretched ahead of them, familiar and beloved, leading home to the life they had built together, one step at a time, one day at a time, one walk at a time, and they followed it with grateful hearts, knowing that the best journeys were the ones you never took alone.